strange phenomenon in 1981 caught the attention of Howard Schultz, who was working as a salesperson. A tiny company from Seattle was placing unusually large orders for handheld coffee makers. It was Starbucks Coffee Shops, a small chain of only 4 locations. However, no one in the U.S. was buying as many handheld coffee makers as they were. This puzzled Howard. Why did everyone in Seattle love this coffee shop, while the rest of the country used electric coffee makers? And Howard decided, I'm going to go and see this company, find out what's going on there. When he arrived in Seattle and approached the door of Starbucks, it opened, and the intoxicating aroma of coffee pulled him inside. Howard found himself in a place resembling a temple of coffee worship. Baskets of coffee from around the world were behind the worn wooden counter, from Sumatra, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Costa Rica. At that time in America, people thought coffee didn't grow, it just appeared from a can. However, Starbucks sold whole bean coffee. It turned out that people preferred handheld coffee makers because they liked the ritual of preparation, and the coffee didn't burn unlike with electric coffee makers. When the young man behind the counter handed Howard freshly brewed coffee, its steam and aroma seemed to envelop his entire face. Adding sugar and milk was considered a mortal sin. Howard took a test sip, and his eyes widened in amazement. He was captivated by its extraordinary taste. It was the strongest coffee he had ever tasted. At Starbucks, they roasted the coffee beans themselves because they firmly believed that dark roasting brings out the fullness of the true coffee flavor. Everything Howard had drunk before seemed like swill. He thirsted to learn how to make it as well and began to question the employees about the company, the types and methods of roasting. Then Howard went to the coffee bean roasting plant to meet the owners of the company, Gerald Baldwin and Gordon Bowker. There he felt again the wonderful aroma of the roasting darkest coffee. It was so rich that his head spun. Howard was curious about why these two decided to devote their entire lives to coffee. At that time, Starbucks was already 10 years old. Interestingly, neither of them even thought about building a business empire. They founded Starbucks for one reason only. They loved coffee and wanted Seattle to have access to the best varieties. It turned out that in the United States, the richest country in the world and leader of the Western market, people were drinking terrible coffee. Most of the consumed coffee was cheap and inferior Robusta varieties. Even real whole bean coffee was diluted with cheap beans in pursuit of profit. Major coffee brands sacrificed taste for competition. The first Starbucks opened in 1971 with 30 varieties of whole bean coffee. It was just a shop, and coffee in cups was not sold then. That's when the tradition of communicating with customers and sharing knowledge about good coffee began. Communication brought people closer together and launched word-of-mouth marketing. That's why the customer base grew quickly. For Starbucks founders, quality was the most important thing. They were advocates for coffee purity and never wanted to please the masses, only a handful of customers with a refined taste. Usually, producers prefer light roasting because it is more profitable. The longer the roasting, the less weight there is. But for Starbucks, taste was more important than profit. This set them apart from everyone else. It takes time to develop a new taste, but gradually the high standard of quality evokes admiration, loyalty, and attachment from people. And at some point, the number of customers exceeds all expectations. Howard couldn't stop thinking about Starbucks, and after a year, he quit his prestigious job with a solid salary of $75,000 for a tiny company of 5 coffee shops. Many thought he was crazy, but Howard wasn't thinking about what Starbucks was, he was thinking about what it could become. He thought about expanding to other cities. Why shouldn't other Americans get to experience real coffee? Howard asked the owners of Starbucks to take him on board and told them, "You have a real treasure. If you offer a cup to anyone from any city, they'll fall in love with your coffee. You can open hundreds of new stores and grow Starbucks to the scale of an entire country." The owners hesitated, but eventually agreed to give him some stocks. Howard dove headfirst into his work. He stood behind the counter, talked to the staff, tasted coffee, and learned how to distinguish the subtle nuances of different roasting methods. As time went on, Howard gained more and more trust from the team. But the most interesting thing happened later. One day, Howard was walking in Italy and looking into every coffee shop to see how they were organized. and what he saw amazed him. Howard saw a gracefully moving barista who was simultaneously talking to customers, grinding beans and pouring coffee. He noticed that the barista greeted everyone by name, and the visitors enjoyed every minute. Howard was enchanted. He discovered the romance of Italian coffee shops with a friendly atmosphere. At that time, there were 200,000 coffee shops in Italy. They were on every corner. Italy had a terrible infrastructure, but incredibly amazing food. Italians are meticulous in their food and only take the best. Americans perceive a coffee shop as a snack bar, and for Italians, it's a cozy home. For Americans, a barista is an unskilled worker. And in Italy, it's a respected person in the community. Here's what Starbucks is missing. It was like a divine revelation. Starbucks sells excellent coffee but doesn't offer it in cups. They only sell coffee in packages. In one of the coffee shops, Howard ordered a drink he had never heard of before, a latte. He thought it would be just coffee with milk, but it turned out to be something else entirely. It was an extraordinary harmony of frothy milk and espresso. The drink was flawless. No one in America knew anything like it. The Italians had turned coffee drinking into a symphony. Howard returned to Seattle inspired, but for the bosses, he was just an overly excited marketing director. The bosses claimed that Starbucks was a store, not a restaurant. Selling drinks in cups would undermine the mission's integrity. Moreover, at that moment, they were busy buying their longtime competitor, Peet's Coffee and Tea, which was up for sale. For Starbucks leaders, this was a chance to expand their store network. The idea seemed more attractive to them than building a restaurant network. After the expensive purchase and expansion, Starbucks got into debt. The big credit tied their hands. The heavy burden deprived them of flexibility. The leaders' attention was scattered between two cities. They had to go back and forth between San Francisco and Seattle. The team's efficiency decreased. And then Howard came up with his idea. That's why the leaders didn't want to sell coffee in cups, and Howard's desperation intensified. The leaders resisted for a long time, but at some point they finally allowed him to open one espresso bar in downtown Seattle. That day, America tried latte for the first time. The coffee shop had twice as many visitors as usual in other Starbucks stores. Gradually, the business grew. Visitors became more and more, and a queue began to form outside. The coffee shop became a meeting place where an exciting atmosphere prevailed. However, the leaders considered this success distracting from the main direction. They didn't want Starbucks to be perceived as a coffee shop where coffee is quickly brewed. They didn't want to become restaurateurs. All they agreed to was to put a bar in one or two more stores and no more than that. The owners thought that Starbucks didn't need to become more than it was. They said, "If there are many visitors, we won't be able to remember them by name as we do now. Sorry, Howard, but you'll have to accept it." Howard fell into depression for several months, paralyzed by uncertainty. The company had financial problems, but even in this difficult situation, it rejected the proven profitable path of development. Howard couldn't simply give up on his grand idea, Italian-style espresso bars, so he left Starbucks to start his own business, coffee shops on crowded streets. He decided that his idea should interest investors. He needed to raise $1.7 million. Howard proudly presented his pitch and business plan for 50 cafes to Fema, a coffee machine manufacturer. Filled with enthusiasm, Howard said, "One day people will say, let's go for a Starbucks instead of let's go for a cup of coffee, and there will be long lines on the streets." It seemed like the offer would be 100% success, since Fema traded coffee machines. And who, if not they, should be more interested in selling their own product? However, Fema refused, citing that Americans were not capable of enjoying espresso the same way Italians did. If you want to know what losers feel like, try to find money for a new business. Doors will be closing in your face. People will treat you with suspicion. They will undermine your belief in yourself. They will call your idea trash. All year, Howard was not just a loser, but the biggest loser. It was the most difficult period of his life. Howard was considered a madman because no one believed that Americans would spend $1.50 on coffee. It took a lot of energy to raise funds. Working days were spent begging for money, running to meetings, and perfecting his pitch. Howard approached anyone he saw as a potential investor. It was the most difficult period of his life. Howard felt like he was being kicked every time he knocked on another door. Howard naively started a conversation with almost everyone. Often people refused with high-handedness, and Howard felt like a poor waiter running back and forth to please for meager tips. Many said the idea was crazy and suggested he look for a normal job. Someone just didn't call back. In a year, Howard met with 242 people, of which 217 said no. It's hard to stay on the rise, constantly listening to everyone saying that your idea is terrible. However, investors' questions and objections were repeated. Therefore, Howard's presentation gradually improved. By irony of fate, the first investor in Howard's idea was Starbucks itself. Jerry Baldwin offered $150,000. The founders of Starbucks didn't want to pursue Howard's idea, but they believed in Howard himself. The first outside investor was a doctor named Ron Margolis. Ron refused to look at the business plan, interrupted Howard's overexcitement, and immediately said, "How much do you need? Is $100,000 enough?" Ron sympathized with Howard because he was already familiar with his professionalism. Ron knew that Howard could be trusted, and that was all that mattered to him. His investments eventually appreciated to $10 million. Then an investor named Harold Gorlick gave more than $200,000, the largest check ever collected at that time. Next, 3 Seattle business leaders invested as a group for $750,000. Jack Benaroya, Herman Sarkowski, and Sam Stroom. All those first investors who believed in Howard were generously rewarded and received a return of 100 to 1. At first, Howard was wary of venture capital because he had heard that some venture capitalists interfered in the management of companies, ultimately ruining them with their short-sighted approach. Bad partners can pursue short-term interests at the expense of the company's future, Howard thought, but his fears proved unfounded. Instead of interference, Howard received a lot of authoritative and experienced advisors. Challenging the conventional wisdom is an incomparable pleasure. Achieving results contrary to accepted opinion is doubly pleasurable. On April 8, 1981, the first coffee shop opened. It was called Il Giornale, pronounced Il Giornale, which means daily in Italian. Howard and his friends frequented the coffee shop, consuming large amounts of food and coffee so potential investors could see how high the sales figures were. Howard recreated an Italian atmosphere. Exceptional Italian opera played in the background. Baristas wore white shirts and bow ties. There were no seats. Newspapers hung on bars along the wall, and there was Italian menu and decor. However, much of this did not appeal to Seattle. The relentless opera music grew tiresome, bow ties proved impractical, and there was nowhere for visitors to sit if they weren't in a hurry. Some of the menu items were also confusing. Howard had to quickly correct all of these mistakes. Nevertheless, the idea worked overall. Within 6 months, the number of customers per day increased from 300 to 1,000. The coffee shop was ahead of its time and seemed like a real treasure. Customers felt special, like members of an exclusive club. The competitive advantage turned out to be speed, but the key to success lay in the employees. Howard infected everyone with the belief in great things. The staff were obsessed with enthusiasm and were willing to work beyond the norm with Howard. The team was like a family in many ways, often visiting each other to eat pizza. After 6 months, Howard opened a second coffee shop. A third coffee shop was opened immediately in Canada to demonstrate the ability to scale to investors. All 3 coffee shops quickly became popular, and sales volumes grew. Meanwhile, the owners of Starbucks, Jerry and Gordon, were experiencing financial difficulties and decided to sell Starbucks to Howard Schultz. As a result, modern Starbucks was born on August 18, 1987. Il Giornale coffee shops were renamed. After the merger, Starbucks became both a store and a coffee shop at the same time. This was its distinguishing feature. It was a new type of coffee shop, more than a store, but not yet a restaurant. Starbucks accelerated its development plans into new cities. Every year, more coffee shops were opened than the previous year. However, as Starbucks grew, so did Howard's fear, because he came across very good small coffee competitors that had every chance of quickly growing and catching up with Starbucks. If it weren't for investments, they would have become a real threat. When growth became inevitable, transportation distances increased, and therefore there was a threat of losing the freshness of the coffee. This problem was solved with vacuum packaging with a one-way valve that released carbon dioxide but did not allow oxygen and moisture in. This trick helped preserve the freshness of freshly roasted coffee. Vacuum packs eliminated the need to spend money on building expensive roasting plants in other regions of the country and helped continue rapid expansion. People drank the freshest coffee even 1,000 miles away from the only plant. Once, Starbucks lost 4 times more than the planned amount. Shareholders thought that Howard had lost his way and didn't know what he was doing. But Howard insisted that they needed to keep losing money until they did 3 things. Build a team for scaling up. Build a world-class new roasting plant. Create a computer system to monitor hundreds of locations. These measures may seem expensive, but timely preparation will allow them to save many times more in the future. This will enable them to be prepared for unexpected problems that inevitably arise from rapid growth and catch them off guard. These seem like obvious things. Anyone would do the same. But it turns out to be extremely difficult to convince investors who love to doubt at the slightest provocation when it comes to money. Howard couldn't imagine how lonely it was to manage a company. Very few could share his difficulties, despair, and anxieties. Howard felt a sharp lack of a professional friend, someone with experience in managing a rapidly growing retail company who could give wise advice. And in Seattle, there was such a person, Jeff Brotman, a man who lived and breathed retail. He created the wholesale store Costco Wholesale and over 20 years turned the company into a chain of 250 wholesale club stores with revenue of $19 billion. Starbucks seemed tiny in comparison. Howard met Jeff when he was seeking investments and could trust him. Jeff had a sixth sense, and he generously shared his advice with Howard. Later, Howard convinced Jeff to join the board of directors because the other members found it easier to believe in Jeff's authority and experience than in Howard's guesses. During a period of intense growth, Howard Schultz needed new investments. However, retail lost its former appeal, and venture capitalists now preferred IT companies. Therefore, many refused Howard. But thanks to the authority of Jeff Brotman, it was possible to persuade Craig Fooey, who at that time headed Citibank's Chancellor Capital Management, Inc., to invest. Craig invested at a low rate. But thanks to his authority and a large investment of $4.5 million, it looked like a gesture of trust, which attracted the attention of other investors. As a result, a record $13.5 million was raised in 1990. At that time, Howard had no idea about venture capital. Years later, he regretted realizing the consequences of premature capital raising. However, unlike the IT business, fast growth offline is only possible through the expansion of retail locations, which inevitably requires constant financial injections, construction, rent, inventory. Therefore, Howard Schultz simply had no choice. Otherwise, there would not have been such rapid and smooth growth. Expansion was accelerating. In 1992, 50 coffee shops were built. In 1993, 100 coffee shops were built. Wall Street analysts were thrilled, watching sales figures. Starbucks primarily targeted markets with more affluent, educated, well-traveled, culturally and artistically interested customers. This audience was perfect for expansion, but competitors were not idle. The coffee business began to attract many other players. Therefore, Starbucks accelerated its efforts to conquer the East Coast, New York, and Boston. In Boston, Starbucks took an unexpected step. Instead of igniting a war with local competitors, such as the Coffee Connection, which consisted of 25 coffee shops, they bought them, and along with them came the recipe for a new drink, the Frappuccino, a mixture of cappuccino, milkshake, and ice cream. The Frappuccino was fantastically popular and instantly became a hit. Everyone was talking about it. On hot days, coffee shops were empty. But with Frappuccinos, Starbucks coffee shops started making a profit even in the summer. Now it is one of Starbucks' most successful products. By the end of 1994, Starbucks had made a lightning-fast leap into many cities across the United States. Expansion was effortless. Opening a new coffee shop was as easy as pouring a cup of coffee. A seamless growth mechanism had been established, which worked so well that eventually Starbucks was opening a coffee shop every day. However, the company faced problems again. In 1994, a strong frost hit Brazil, causing coffee prices to skyrocket. Brazil accounts for a third of the world's coffee supply. Starbucks stocks plummeted as a result. The previous frost in 1986 kept coffee prices high for several years, posing a serious crisis threat to Starbucks. Fortunately, the company had a 10-month supply of green coffee due to long-term fixed-price contracts. Starbucks was protected because they purchased coffee directly. Otherwise, they would have had to overpay 3 times as much. This is what sets Starbucks apart from other businesses. It's not just a coffee shop, but also a producer, importer, and wholesale seller. 4 in 1. The company does everything itself, from roasting to serving a steaming cup in its own store. Large companies immediately raised coffee prices in stores. Their supplies were modest, so they had no choice. Starbucks supplies allowed them to keep prices low. Even during this crisis period, Starbucks was able to turn a profit through internal optimization and cost-cutting. It turned out that there were many weak spots inside the company, in contracts, expenses, planning, and resources. Perhaps without the crisis, Starbucks would have never noticed its weaknesses. Howard Schultz was always amazed that, ironically, the company grew best during major failures. As the Starbucks network grew, visitors began to complain that all coffee shops were the same. On the contrary, individual competitors impressed with their original decor and whimsical style. For Starbucks, this was like a knife to the heart. How to open 300 coffee shops a year and at the same time make sure they don't look like 2 drops of water. Starbucks began experimenting a lot with design, and it turned out that people cared more about sofas, armchairs, fireplaces. This created a special atmosphere. In one of the coffee shops in Manhattan, they put worn-out sofas and soft armchairs bought at a garage sale. The coffee shop quickly became popular and turned into an afternoon oasis and meeting place. But original design is very expensive, and this did not fit well with the strategy of rapid growth. Standardizing design helped to solve this problem, and a large number of coffee shops gave an advantage in procurement. They determined the minimum number of interior elements necessary for one coffee shop and began to purchase them at wholesale prices. As a result, it was possible to reduce costs and the time to develop a coffee shop from 24 weeks to 18. And the freed-up resources were invested in creativity. To stimulate creativity, Howard Schultz organized a secret studio and hired a team of architects, artists, and designers. And he tasked them with creating a model of the coffee shop of the future, going beyond the familiar and creating a lyrical design. The studio was secret, so that the new design would have a more noticeable effect due to its unexpectedness. Designers and artists studied the mythology of sirens, the idea of the third place, coffee culture, varieties, frescoes, literature, and more. As a result, the designers moved away from dryness to romance and added an atmosphere with a handmade effect. To do this, they took the concept of the 4 elements: earth, fire, water, and air. They correlated them with the 4 stages of coffee preparation: cultivation, roasting, brewing, and aroma. As a result, 4 types of design were born, which diversified all Starbucks coffee shops. There was even a case when one company completely copied the interior of a Starbucks coffee shop, all the colors, logo, and even brochures. Every time a coffee shop opened in a new city, someone inevitably predicted failure. No one believed that espresso would become so popular, and that coffee shops would appear at intersections throughout America. Nevertheless, in every city, on the first day of the coffee shop's operation, a queue formed. However, although Howard Schultz was a marketer, he did not advertise. So what was the secret? The secret was that direct advertising was not very effective. It is much easier to provoke word-of-mouth advertising when people talk about you themselves. To do this in each city, Starbucks organized concerts with famous musicians, inviting influential figures from the city. By attracting the attention of influential people, Starbucks launched word-of-mouth advertising about itself. From the moment the first Starbucks coffee shop opened in Tokyo, a line formed from opening until closing time. Despite the fact that coffee shops are on every corner in Tokyo, the Starbucks brand had the same power there as it did in Seattle. Howard Schultz did not set out to build a strong brand. The brand became a consequence of a passionate team. Starbucks invested in its employees. Traditional businesses fight for market share. But Starbucks created a new market. When the average check is $3.50, it's hard to make a customer come back. However, Starbucks customers return an average of 18 times a month. The most powerful brands are built with heart and spirit, not advertising campaigns. Usually, a brand is built on a quality product, but Starbucks customers return not only for coffee, but for the people and the atmosphere. When you walk into Starbucks, the staff make every effort to make you feel special. Greet you with a smile, make you feel smart, and call you by name. It's hard to forget. Unfortunately, mediocrity reigns everywhere nowadays. We are being served by people who couldn't care less about us. They are only interested in our money. Take too much water for brewing, and the coffee will not taste good. If you overheat the coffee pot, the coffee will be burnt. Service staff are the lowest paid, yet they are the face of the company. When an old employee leaves, the connection with the customers is lost. And they leave too. One unpleasant experience and you lose a customer forever. Howard Schultz reduced employee turnover and changed the attitude towards work. In the late 80s, generosity was not in fashion, and social packages were a rarity. But instead of cutting costs on medical services, Starbucks increased them. It seemed like a crazy idea. The board members were puzzled because it was a huge, unnecessary expense. But it turned out to be the best decision in the company's history. In fast food chains, turnover usually ranges from 150% to 400% per year. But at Starbucks, it became less than 65%. Reducing turnover significantly reduced hiring and training costs, as training a new employee costs twice as much as providing social benefits. No matter how elegant a business plan may be, it is of no use if employees do not invest their hearts in the common cause. Howard Schultz even met with President Clinton on this matter. At some point, it seemed like Starbucks was already on every corner. For consumers, the bigger the company, the less human it seems. Large companies lose their individuality, while small business owners are perceived as caring workers. The society has a belief that big means bad. Howard Schultz broke this stereotype. He distributed stock options to more than 700 employees in 1991. One option amounted to 12% of their annual salary. Later, these employees were able to sell them and afford expensive cars and country homes. Such a policy contradicts the business world's conventional wisdom. Usually, companies focus on profit and consider their employees as expendable. However, by owning stocks, an employee feels a sense of belonging and approaches work with the same responsibility as the company's CEO. Usually, stocks are given to leading programmers in IT companies, but in the history of trade, this has never happened before. The distribution of options changed the employee's attitude. They began to come up with innovative ideas to increase sales, develop new products, and reduce costs. One such employee was Howard Bayer. He often raised his voice at meetings. He was passionate and embarrassed everyone with his straightforwardness. Whatever he had in mind, he spoke plainly. Usually people are reserved, trying not to offend, beating around the bush. But Howard Bayer openly argued with anyone, anytime, at meetings, at the factory, and in the corridors. He said, "Why is the word people on the third page? Why not give customers everything they want? Why are coffee shop managers afraid to express their opinion?" Howard Bayer clearly articulated his thoughts and sought honesty from others. Once he said that every coffee shop should open 10 minutes earlier and close 10 minutes later to exceed customer expectations, thus infuriating coffee shop directors to the extreme. But his goal was different. With such a bold statement, he shocked his interlocutors, thereby invigorating them and disposing them to frank conversation. Otherwise, without honesty and openness, a new idea cannot be born. He intentionally provoked conflict to make others look at things more broadly. Howard Bayer made many people part with their dogmas and reconsider many values. Once Bayer noticed an interesting thing. Many visitors wanted skim milk, but Starbucks did not offer it. Bayer ran to Howard Schultz and boldly said, "Do you read visitor feedback?" "Of course." "Then why don't you react?" "React to what?" "Look at how many people want skim milk." "Well, I conducted a tasting and it just doesn't taste good." "For whose taste?" Bayer said, losing his temper. When skim milk was introduced at Starbucks, it was equivalent to treason. The problem of full-fat milk caused one of the most heated debates in the company's history. Howard Bayer was against everyone else, and everyone else was against him. He insisted that Schultz at least try it, but it was all in vain. If you grow a company like you grow a child, it's hard to get rid of the instinctive desire to take care of every little detail. But at some point, Schultz realized that ignoring new ideas was depriving the company of great opportunities. Typically, innovative ideas come from middle managers and ordinary employees. Now, half of the sales volume of that same latte is made with skim milk. Howard Behar hit the heart of the customer. The mistake of many entrepreneurs is to appoint loyal and devoted people as leaders, but they lack the necessary skills. Devoted assistants nod in agreement at every opportunity, flattering your ego, and strong people encourage growth. If a person is able to assemble a team, inspire and unite them on the same wavelength, together they can work wonders. The idea of compiling a collection of jazz hits and selling them on an exclusive disc also emerged. Many visitors enjoyed the music played in the coffee shops and left hundreds of requests for it to be sold to them, as many people don't have the time to find good music themselves. And although CDs are not usually sold in coffee shops, in reality, sales were 3 times higher than expected, amounting to 75,000 discs. A few weeks later, Ralph Simon, vice president of Capitol Records, said that if the record sales were tracked like regular albums, it would have made the top 10 jazz charts of Billboard. The power of the Starbucks brand and the company's spirit cannot be touched or converted into numbers. However, before the initial public offering, IPO, an adequate valuation of the company's worth is important. Although large investment banks were impressed by Starbucks' economy and efficiency, for them, Starbucks was just another unremarkable option from a long list of potential IPOs. They only evaluated numbers and didn't take the company's values into account. It's unknown to bankers how difficult it is year after year to build a company's values. Bankers are people from another world. They don't care about how Starbucks treats its employees. Only financial gain is important to them. Biotechnology and fiber optics were considered the best areas for investment, and coffee shops seemed unremarkable. Bankers didn't believe that Starbucks could sustain high growth rates. Therefore, Howard Schultz searched for a long time for someone who understood that Starbucks wasn't just another restaurant. He held a competition among 7 investment banks to find someone who truly shared his passion for Starbucks. And he found Dan Levitan from Wertheim Schroeder. He understood what was at stake. It was about an ambitious company that risked changing Americans' relationship with coffee. On June 26, 1996, Starbucks went public at a starting price of $17 per share. Most new companies' prices fall immediately after going public, but as soon as Starbucks started trading, its shares soared to $20 each. Contrary to Wall Street analysts' predictions, the stock price remained high for a long time, reaching $33 within 3 months. As a result of the IPO, the company raised much more than expected, $420 million. Starbucks entered the big leagues. The value of Starbucks' shares always exceeded its earnings, much to the delight of skeptics. Therefore, speculators loved to bet against it, but they always lost. Why are people willing to stand in long queues for a simple cup of coffee? At first glance, it may seem that it's just for the coffee. However, it goes much deeper than that. It's a cozy corner between work and home where people can escape from their daily worries. Exotic types of coffee and drinks are a luxury that anyone can afford. Customers are willing to take a long detour just to stop by and have their morning coffee. Some competitors openly admit that they're waiting for Starbucks to come to their location because when people know that there's a place where they can sit down and relax, they flock there. In the end, both sides win. Going to Starbucks is like taking a brief break from the hustle and bustle. It's a breath of fresh air. People come here not for the coffee, but for the atmosphere and socializing. It's not just coffee, and not even coffee for connoisseurs. It's a lifestyle phenomenon. Liked it? Give it a thumbs up, leave a comment, watch videos. See you soon, friends.